the fat max zone is, let me think, it's something like 69 to 79% of your heart rate max. If you email me, I'll double check those numbers because I always get the VO2 percentage and the heart rate percentage muddled up. So if you drop me a quick email, I can double check them in my notes and let you know. All right, so we'll just quickly look at the progression and then we'll start on the resistance work. So, progressive overload, the idea of progressive overload is a training principle that you want to make sure you utilize. You guys do it automatically when you're training, but when you're working with other individuals, you want to make sure that you use progressive overload appropriately. Depends, again, what is their goal for the program, all right? If their goal is to get to a certain level of health or fitness and then just maintain that, then I don't need to overload on a regular basis, all right? But if I'm working with someone who wants to keep pushing themselves and wants to get stronger, wants to get fitter, wants to get more flexible, then we've got to use this idea of progression, okay? So when we're looking at cardio work, we've got a couple of different options. We can transition from something that is relatively low impact, so they may be just walking to begin with, or they may be riding a bike, and then you could transition to something that is more high impact, that would add more stress to the bones, because if I start to jog or I start to run, there's a flight phase involved. If there's a flight phase, then there's more impact as I hit the floor. So that means that I'm going to improve bone health, and plus remember our elongation is our strengthening move. So once I'm jogging or running, there's more work for the quads to do and the hamstrings and the butt, and so I'm going to get stronger if I jog and run. Now, you might have a client, i.e. me, who goes, I'm not doing that. I'm not interested in jogging or running. I'll walk as fast as I can, but I don't like jogging. It's just not, it doesn't feel good to me. So then I've got some other options, right? I can progress how long they're going for. So I could take that minimal threshold of 20 and 30 minutes and then start adding until we get to our maximum of 60 minutes, right? So that's a way we could do progression. We add, the recommendation is add somewhere between 5 to 10 minutes, depending upon your individual, every 1 to 2 weeks for the first month, 2 months, right? So that's an option. And then our third option is using our intensity for progression. So if I start someone off at the low end of the intensity range, then I can just up the workload a little bit every week or every couple of weeks. So they run the same time, but they run a little bit faster, or they walk a little bit faster. Or I put them on an incline or a decline, right? So there are ways of making them work harder that don't necessarily mean I have to return to jogging or running, right? I can make them do high knee lifts, for example. Or if they're working in a gym and they're on a treadmill, then I can start to bump up the incline. They can keep walking, but their heart rate will go up because it's harder work. So you increase the intensity. Right? So So we've got, as I said, we've got several options for this idea of progression, depending on who you're working with, what their goals are, what their preferences are, you know, what's comfortable. You want to push them a little bit, but you don't want to make them do something they hate because then they quit, right? See, it's always a game, right? How can I keep them coming back? Because if they don't come back, A, I don't get paid, and B, then they're not getting more healthy, and that's my job, is to help them get healthy, right? All right. So back to our matrix, all right? So our frequency. When we are looking at resistance work, frequency is dictated by the number of times we end up training a body part. Right? The recommendation is that we train all major muscle groups twice a week. So, again, I've got some options then. All right? Each group, a minimum of twice up to 3 times a week. So, again, depending upon the person, depending upon their preferences, their time allocation, things like that, I can do a total body workout, so like a circuit, twice a week. Right? So I'm going to hit arms, chest, back, shoulders, abs, legs, calves, every time I go to the gym. Okay? The research indicates, which is really interesting, that doing 2 sets doesn't benefit you any more than doing 1 set when you're a beginner. So, 1 set for each body part is going to improve their strength to the equivalent of 2 sets. And it cuts down the amount of time they have to be in the gym or doing the session. So that's good. The problem with that then is that the jump for really big improvements means going from 1 set to 3 sets, which psychologically is quite a big jump, and time-wise is a big jump. I haven't done any gym work for a couple of years. I've been concentrating on other stuff, but I used to find that if I went to the gym and I only did 1 set, I felt like I didn't do anything. But I didn't have time to do 3 sets. So I would do the 2 sets because in here, I needed to do 2 sets to feel like I had done something in the session. Okay? Even though I knew that physiologically 2 sets wasn't benefiting me that much. For the amount of time that it takes to do 2 sets, you don't get a big enough payback versus 1 set. Does that make sense to everybody? So, again, you know, it's swings and roundabouts. How do I balance the program to suit the individual? The other option I have is to do what a lot of us do, is a split routine. So instead of doing everything on one day, I go in and I work chest, shoulders, and triceps. And the next day I go in and I work back and legs, maybe. Or I work back and biceps and abs. And then the third day I go in and I do a leg day. Well, that's great, except if I have to do every major body part twice a week, that means I have to go to the gym 4 to 6 times a week. Okay? Now, those of us that are a little gym rats and a little sick in the head, right? I used to train 7 sessions a week at one point. It was silly, right? Well, it wasn't silly, it was a load of fun. I loved it, and I was really, really strong. But I grew out of it. It's like, yeah, I'd rather be outside. So, you know, we can do that, but that's a lot of time in the gym. And then you've got to remember that you're combining this with a cardio requirement of a minimum of 3 days. So if I'm going to be in the gym 4 times, 5 times, 6 times a week, and I have to do cardio 3 days a week, that means there are days where I have to do both together. Right? So frequency, minimum of 2 to 3 times a week per major muscle group. Right? And then how am I going to organize that? I'm going to flip the slide because I believe intensity. None of these slides are in the order of the matrix. Intensity. So, our intensity for our aerobic work is a percentage of heart rate max, a percentage of VO2 max, Borg scale if I'm working with someone who's experienced, right? Those kinds of measures. They're my aerobic intensity measures. When I'm looking at resistance work, intensity is measured by using your maximum weight, right, for the lift or the exercise. So I measure a 1 rep max, and then my intensity is X percentage of my 1 rep max. So the amount of weight on the bar becomes the intensity measure because it's related to the work that you're doing, right? That's all well and good if you're working in a good gym with good spotters and safe equipment, and someone who's already got some background in weight training so they understand the technique of the lift. 1 RMs are not safe. Right? A 1 RM is a very dangerous assessment. You do not want to use a 1 RM with someone who is inexperienced. You cannot use a 1 RM unless you've got spotters available to help the person if they get stuck. Right? So a 1 RM is great if you're LV and you're in an athletic gym, but a 1 RM is not a good assessment choice if you're working with Joe Average, right? So we have some other options when we're looking at a typical population. We can do a 3 RM. Even that could be tricky if they don't have a lot of experience, right? You can even do an 8 RM, right? Find the amount of weight they can push for 8 or 10 reps, and they're going to do 100% of their 10 rep max, or 50% of their 10 rep max for a warm-up, right? So you can use the same idea that we would use with athletes, but make it safer for the general population, right? But it's important to remember, intensity is the workload. How hard am I working? So I can't measure intensity when I'm lifting by percentage of my heart rate. I mean, I can, particularly if I'm doing a circuit, right? But if I'm doing a real lifting program, resistance program, then how hard I'm working is linked to how much weight I am lifting, right? So, if I'm doing a body weight exercise, like chin-ups, then my intensity is my body weight, right? Because that's the amount, or my intensity is my body weight plus however much weight I hang on the belt if I'm a lunatic, right? Okay? If I'm doing press-ups, my intensity is my body weight unless I'm putting weight on my back while I'm doing press-ups. Does that make sense? Right? Intensity is always how hard I'm working. Okay. So, frequency, intensity, time. How do we measure time for a resistance program? All right. So, the amount of time, volume, duration, is measured by how many exercises am I doing, how many sets of each exercise am I doing, how many reps am I doing within each set, plus what's my rest period. So the focus of the program, the goal, right? What's the focus? Why am I doing it? Dramatically changes the time. Because if I'm doing muscular endurance work and I'm going to be doing 15, 20, 22 reps per set, and I'm trying to do 3-4 sets per exercise, I'm going to be in there a long time, right? If I'm doing a max and I'm going to do 3 reps for 5 sets, I might need a longer rest, but I'm going to get out of the gym quite quick, especially if I'm only doing a body part, right? So, again, it's really, you can't, like, there isn't a rule. There's the guidelines, and then it's go it alone and make it up as you go along, right? And it's different for everybody. So our final T, our type, loads. We got loads, right? We can do free weights, we can do machines, we can do bands, we can do body weight, lots of options, okay? So when you are working with someone who goes, oh, I don't want to go to a gym, doesn't mean you don't do open resistance work within their program. It means you do walk around the trail, get to the picnic bench, do 3 press-ups, right? Walk around the trail, get back to the picnic bench, do some step-ups. They're resistance work. And they keep the heart rate up, which means that then you are hitting their fat loss. Okay? So, you've got to be careful how you, again, I think, right? I'm a bit hung up on this, you might have worked out. The verbiage is important. If you call it a weight training program, some people are going to turn off straight away. If you call it a resistance program to keep your bones and your muscles healthy, then for some people that is manageable, right? Okay. Back to the next slide. Progressions. Ooh. So, progressions for resistance work. So, generally, the first thing you're going to look at is increasing either the intensity, so increasing the amount of weight, or increasing the volume, therefore increasing the amount of time. Okay? Typically, what we tend to do is put more weight on the bar. If you put more weight on the bar, you have to decrease the volume that they're doing. Right? So it might be better with certain people to increase the volume, increase the sets and the reps first before you add more intensity by putting more weight on the bar. Right? You've got a choice. For athletes, typically, we put more weight on the bar first. Right? But with the general population, you might have someone that is a little resistant to lifting more because they don't want big muscles. And then you have to go into a whole long conversation about the fact that the muscle fiber type you use to lift weights doesn't grow very big, and so you're not going to get them, right? It might be easier just to increase the volume. The other option you've got, the third option, is what am I doing with my rest periods? So if I'm doing 3 sets of 12 reps and I'm taking a minute's rest in between each set, I need to start thinking on that minute because that's too long, right? Can I get that minute down to half a minute? Okay, that's also progression, because now I'm going to be working the energy, I'm going to be stressing the energy system because it doesn't have so much time to recover in between each set. Okay? Does that make sense? Now, how much rest I want depends which energy system I'm trying to stress. If I'm trying to stress the ATP-PC system, then I need to make it work before it's had time to recover in order to make it adapt. If I'm working big heavy weights, then I'm not working ATP-PC. I can take a whole load of rest. Make sense? So, flexibility, column number 3. On Blackboard, there's a copy of this article for you. It's the ACSM recommendations. It's called Wouldn't You Like to Know? It's a really good article. I keep checking the ACSM website to see if they've updated it, and because there are a couple of, when you look at their version of the matrix, there are a couple of boxes empty where they go, we don't know yet. So I keep checking back to see if we know yet, but I haven't found anything different. So for flexibility, their recommendation is a minimum 2 to 3 days to a maximum of daily. So again, we have a range that we can manipulate to suit the individual that we're working with. All right? The intensity for flexibility is to take the stretch to the point of discomfort and stay there. Right? So you want to point of tightness, little bit of discomfort. There should not be any pain. The different discomfort and pain are not the same. And again, if you're working with a true beginner, you're going to have trouble getting them to identify the difference initially, right? So you might have to be a little easy on the flexy stuff to begin with while they get used to the fact that it's okay if it's uncomfortable, but it shouldn't be hurting, right? But people who don't exercise regularly, a little bit of pain is hurt, right? So you have to help them learn to identify the difference. The amount of time for flexibility work, the ACSM recommendation is 60 seconds total per exercise. So you can do a static stretch and hold it for the whole minute. You can do a static stretch, hold it for 30 seconds, come out of the stretch, go back into the stretch, hold it for, or you could do 10 seconds. From my background, being a gymnast and a dancer, you ain't gonna get much flexibility improvement in 60 seconds. That's my personal opinion. I do not have anything to back that up except my experience and my background. All right? If someone really wants to improve their range of motion, it's going to take more than 60 seconds. Even if you did 60 seconds on that stretch every day, I don't think that's going to significantly improve your range of motion. I could be wrong.
So when we write down programs, which one do you think we should do?
I would stick with the recommendation initially and see what that produces, and if it isn't producing the gains in flexibility that the individual wants, then I would do longer.
How much longer would you go, say?
I would go
2 to 3?
2 or 3 minutes per stretch. But as I say, that's my personal opinion. I don't have any research to back that up. It's just, I know how hard and how long we had to hold those stretches when I was young to get some improvement. You know, and some people, here's the other thing, some people are naturally strong and they build muscle easily and they get strong easily. And some people are naturally flexible and increasing range of motion is a piece of cake. And until you start working with someone, you just don't know. You know? Type. So, earlier in the semester I said we were going to come back to our muscle spindles and our Golgi tendon organs when we looked at flexibility. All right, we've got 3 options for flexibility. Well, 4 now, because now we have dynamic kind of functional flexibility, which wasn't really a thing. There's not a lot of research on it yet. The first one is bouncing. Bad, 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 bad. Do not bounce. Unless you are working with someone who is significantly experienced at flexibility work, like a dancer, I would not do any version of bouncing stretching. So bouncing stretching means you go to the point of discomfort and then you bounce past your range of motion. Right? It's effective. It hurts like heck. Right? And they're going to be really, really sore. Because what happens when I stretch the muscle spindle very quickly? Right? We get a signal back to tighten up that muscle. So bouncing puts you at a lot of risk for tearing a muscle. Right? It's really not a good plan, as I say, unless you know what you're doing. So I would nix the bouncing. Right? Second option is a static stretch. Static stretches are a little less effective. They take longer to make a change, but they're safe, is the thing. So it's a good one to use with the general population. So on a static stretch, you take that stretch to the point of discomfort and you tell them to count. 1, 2, 3, right? And then depending on how you want to create their 60 seconds, okay? So that's the safest, is static. The third one is PNF. right? PNF stands for proprio-neuromuscular facilitation, so it's way easier just to call it PNF, okay? And then look it up if you have to find out what PNF stands for, right? PNF is really interesting, very effective. You need 2 people generally. You can do it yourself against a wall or something, but it's easier to do it with a partner. So PNF utilizes the Golgi tendon organ. And what we do with PNF is we apply a force, a contraction on the muscle, a really hard contraction. That turns the Golgi tendon organ on, which then sends a signal for the muscle to relax. And as it's relaxing, we stretch it. Right? So, can I borrow you, Alex? We can do this, right? She's going to hold my leg there, and I contract the hamstring. So I contract as hard as I can, and then I relax and she pushes, right? And then I contract as hard as I can, and I relax and she pushes. And you can just keep going, right? It's very effective because, thank you. It's very effective. You can do it with your shoulders, right? Any kind of stretch. Because you get this additional relaxation that builds into the stretching. So the muscle is relaxing, makes it easier to push. You've got to be careful, because if she pushes fast, now we initiate the muscle spindles and we undo all the relaxation. So the push has to be very gentle, right? That means that both people who are participating have to understand how it works. You don't have to necessarily, I would, but you don't have to go into the Golgi tendon organ. But the person stretching has to understand that they cannot push quickly. And the person being stretched has to understand that you can't just kind of willy-nilly push it. You've got to really contract hard the muscle that you're then trying to increase the flexibility of. Does that make sense? So it's a great tool. It just takes 2 people. Generally, you know, as I said, I mean, you can do it for yourself, push, 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 relax, but it's not as, especially if you're trying to do hamstrings, it's not as easy to do on your own. Okay. And then we've got dynamic stretching, and there's a whole load of controversy going on at the moment about dynamic stretching and static stretching and the impact on power events. So there's research that shows that if you do a static stretch before a power sprint or a jump, for example, that there is a correlation with a decrease in the amount of power you can generate if you do a static stretch. They're not exactly sure of the mechanism that causes that. It could be that the stretch stretches out the connective tissue and the cross bridge, the actin and myosin, and so then they can't make as many cross bridges as quickly. And so a lot of people have started to say, well, you can't do static stretching in the warm-up or before you do your event. You've got to do dynamic stuff, right? So the studies that say static stretching impacts power do a stretch and then a jump. Well, that's not what happens in real life. Like, even if I'm a sprinter and I'm stretching out my Achilles, I've still got to then get down and get into my blocks and get ready. So there's like 10 seconds at least between the stretch and the gun. That's not the way the research papers have looked at it so far. So they're kind of labby based and they're not yet looking at the reality, in my view, in the real world. My other problem, a little bit of problem with the dynamic thing, is if you don't do some static stretching first, and you go straight into, so I watch the volleyball players or the soccer players. Well, that's muscle spindle activation, and that's a perfect example of bouncing and setting them up for a hamstring tear. So unless you warm them up, run, bike, whatever, and then you do some static stretching, and then you do your dynamic stretching before you do your sprint training, right? So right now, the whole mush of stretching and power events is a bit of a mess. I also think you have to be a little careful. There's a difference between stretching and flexibility, right? Flexibility work is deliberately done to increase your range of motion. Stretching is done to warm you up and get you ready for your event, right? In my view. There's a lot of in my view in this chapter. So I think that sometimes we don't distinguish between stretching and flexibility work. I say to the athletes all the time, you should take a yoga class. You will work really, really hard on your strengthening, you will work really, really hard on your conditioning, and you do diddly squish on your flexibility. And then you wonder why you get hurt. Right? So, stretching to warm up is not increasing your range of motion and helping with all the muscle mass that you're putting on. Right? Okay, so we've got flexibility. Last column is relatively new. Alright? It's been added in the last 3-4 years. And it is neuromotor. So neuromotor exercises are especially recommended for an older population or a diabetic population, people who are at risk of falls. But there's huge benefits to younger and middle-aged people as well, right? So that they don't get to the point where they're at risk of falls. So neuromotor at the moment, it's the one that we have the least amount of information on. The recommendation is a minimum 2 to 3 days a week or more. So there's not really a maximum at the moment. The intensity hasn't been determined, so we just don't know how much work we have to do in order to see adaptation in the neuromotor system. So we just don't know, all right? Time-wise, they think 20 minutes maybe minimum, but it might be more. Again, until the research is done, we really don't know. The type, so this is where it gets interesting. The type is things like balance activities, agility activities, coordination activities, gait activities, so walking, right? So classes like Tai Chi and yoga do all of that within one class. Or if you're working with athletes, then ladder drills, corner drills, those kinds of agility drills would hit the neuromotor column. Okay. As I say, it's the one we know the least about, but it's going to be interesting as we find out more. You know, just how much do we have to do of that to see an improvement? How much balance work do I have to do to see an improvement in my balance?
Would you say aqua aerobics like Kelsey said?
I don't think an actual aerobics class or a Zumba class probably would, to some degree, but I don't know with the aqua, because you've got so much support from the water, I don't think that you're challenging those systems enough. Yoga balls, Bozus, right? All those things would count under there. Okay, so what have I got next? Aha! All right, so hopefully Friday, if I can talk fast enough, we will look at interval training, we will look at periodization, we will look at overtraining. Pretty good. And then we'll have finished another chapter. Already? Yes, please. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, because I was